So, guys, John Mark Dugan. I am back with a NewsGuard article. For those of you that didn't catch my last video, it's about a guy by the name of Stephen Brill, deep state scumbag in bed with the Department of Defense, and he is pushing the news that the government wants you to hear, and his company, NewsGuard, is responsible for getting rid of a lot of articles and stuff that they do not want you to hear about. There's a publication called Consortium News, very objective publication, okay? Very neutral. They wrote a scathing response to getting a red check mark by NewsGuard. And I'm going to read that article now because I'm going to read that article to you now. The article is titled, "The Response NewsGuard Rejected." On June 2nd, now this is 2022, on June 2nd, Consortium News responded to NewsGuard's allegation that Consortium News was publishing false content on Ukraine, a response NewsGuard rejected when it gave Consortium News its red mark. The Pentagon and State Department linked outfit with an ex-NSA and CIA director on its board is accusing Consortium News of publishing false content on Ukraine, reports Joe Loria. Consortium News is being reviewed by NewsGuard, a U.S. government-linked organization that is trying to enforce a narrative on Ukraine while seeking to discredit dissenting views. The organization has accused Consortium News, begun in 1995 by former Associated Press investigative reporter Robert Perry, of publishing a false content on Ukraine. It calls false essential facts about Ukraine that have been suppressed in the mainstream media. Number one, that there was a U.S.-backed coup in 2014. And number two, that neo-Nazism is a significant force in Ukraine. Reporting crucial information left out of corporate media is Consortium News' essential mission. But NewsGuard considers these facts to be myths and is demanding Consortium News to correct these errors. Now, who is NewsGuard? NewsGuard set itself up in 2018 as a judge of news organizations' credibility. The front page of NewsGuard's website shows that it is partners with the State Department and the Pentagon, as well as several major corporations such as Microsoft. The nature of these partnerships is not entirely clear. And on a side note, the WHO is also on their website. NewsGuard is a private corporation that can shield itself from First Amendment obligations, but it has connections to formerly high-ranking U.S. government officials in addition to its partnerships with the State Department and the Pentagon. Among those sitting on NewsGuard's advisory board are General Michael Hayden, the former Central Intelligence Agency and National Security Agency Director, Tom Ridge, the first U.S. Homeland Security Director, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, a former Secretary General of NATO. Tell me that's not some kind of conflict of interest. Yeah. NewsGuard says its advisors provide advice and subject matter expertise to NewsGuard. They play no role in the determinations of ratings or the nutritional label write-ups of websites unless otherwise noted, and have no role in the governance of management of organizations. On a side note, if you guys believe that, no, sorry. The co-CEO with former Wall Street Journal publisher Louis Gordon Grovitz is Stephen Brill, who in the 1990s published Brill's Content, a magazine that was billed as a watchdog of the press, critiquing the role of the media to hold government to account. On a side note, somewhere along the way, he got hijacked and he is on the take. That's just my personal opinion, but let's continue the article. NewsGuard is a government-affiliated organization judging media like Consortium News that is totally independent of government or corporations. NewsGuard has a rating process that results in a news organization receiving either a green or red label. Fox News and other major media, for example, have received green labels. Getting a red label means that potentially millions of people that have the NewsGuard extension installed and operating on their browsers will see the green or red mark affixed to websites on social media in Google searches. For individuals that do not already have it installed and are operating on Microsoft's browser, it costs $4.95 a month in the US and £4.95 in the UK, or €4.95 in the EU to run the extension. Now, according to NewsGuard, libraries in the United States and Britain have had it installed on their computers, and it is also being put on computers of U.S. active duty personnel. Slate reported in January 2019 that NewsGuard, quote, struck a deal with Microsoft to incorporate these ratings into tech giant's Edge browser as an optional setting. That's when The Guardian noticed that the Mail Online had been tagged by NewsGuard with a red label, a reliability score 3 out of 9, and the following warning: proceed with caution. This website generally fails to maintain basic standards for accuracy and accountability. For Microsoft Edge users with the news ratings feature turned on, that warning appeared alongside every link to the Mail Online, whether in Google searches result, Facebook or Twitter feeds, or the Mail's own homepage. The approach to Consortium News. Consortium News was contacted by NewsGuard analyst Zachary Fishman. In his request to speak to someone at Consortium News, he said categorically CN had published false content and that the interview would be on the record. I'm hoping to talk to somebody who can answer a few questions about its structure and editorial processes, including its ownership, its handling of corrections, and its publication of false content. He wrote in an email. As editor-in-chief, I informed him that our founder, editors, and writers came from high levels of establishment journalism. I told him in thousands of press interviews I've conducted over nearly half a century in journalism that I've never known anyone accusing a prospective interviewee of misconduct up front and then determining that the interview would be on the record, when the ground rules are usually set by the person being interviewed. Fishman apologized and tried to say his mind wasn't made up about Consortium News when he had clearly stated that it was. He said, quote, I do apologize that the wording of my email insinuated that I had come to a predetermined conclusion on whether your website had published false content when I have not. Be sure that I am interested in your responses to my questions, he wrote in an email. According to his LinkedIn profile, Fishman had one previous job in science and financial journalism that lasted 15 months for a company called Fast Inform that is now defunct. Last month, all the links of his published pieces on LinkedIn went to a site that no longer exists. The links have now been removed. Fishman has degrees in health, environment, and science journalism, and engineering physics. He has no experience in political reporting, and especially the politics of Eastern Europe and U.S.-Russia relations. NewsGuard's determination on Consortium News will be made by the analyst and at least one senior editor at NewsGuard's co-CEO review every nutritional label prior to publication to ensure that the rating is as fair and accurate as possible. Well, side note, that sounds like bullshit. All right, first charge. There is no U.S.-backed coup. NewsGuard alleges that Consortium News has published false content by reporting there was a U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 and that neo-Nazis have significant influence in the country. Fishman took issue with, quote, February 2022 article, Ukraine, Guides to Reflection, which asserted, hence the inflation of Russian behavior in Ukraine, where Washington organized a coup against a democratically elected government because we disliked its political complexion. Fishman then wrote, the U.S. supported the Maidan revolution that ousted then Ukraine President Viktor Yanukovych and in 2014, including a December 2013 visit by John McCain to Kiev in support of protesters, but there is no evidence that the U.S. organized a coup. Instead, it has the markings of a popular uprising precipitated by widely covered protests against Yanukovych's decision to suspend preparations for the signing of an association and free trade agreement with the EU. Now, Viktor Yanukovych was democratically elected as a president in Ukraine in 2010 in an election certified by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a fact not mentioned in NewsGuard's writings on the change of government in Ukraine. Even though Yanukovych agreed to an EU political settlement and early elections, violence forced him to flee from the capital on February 21st, 2014, reporting that the neo-Nazi right sector was at the forefront of the violent overthrow. The New York Times Green Check wrote earlier that day, Dmytro Yarosh, the leader of the right sector, a coalition of hardline nationalist groups, reacted defiantly to the news of the settlement, drawing more cheers from the crowd. The agreements that were reached do not correspond to our aspirations, he said. Right sector will not lay down arms. Right sector will not lift the blockade of a single administration building until our main demand is met, the resignation of Yanukovych. He added that he and his supporters were ready to take responsibility for the further development of the revolution. The crowd shouted, "Good, good." A study on the violence used to overthrow the government by professional Serhiy Kudiela, a political scientist at Baylor University, says the overthrow succeeded because of the embeddedness of violent groups. In a nonviolent protest, the violence began on December 1st, 2013, when these violent groups attacked police with iron chains, flares, stones, and petrol bombs, or gasoline bombs, and tried to ram a bulldozer through police lines. The police viciously fought back that day. As the International Business Times, IBT, Green Check, wrote about these groups at the time, according to a member of Anti-Fascist Union Ukraine, a group that monitors and fights fascism in Ukraine, there are lots of nationalists here, Euromaidan, including Nazis. They came from all over Ukraine, and they make up about 30% of the protesters. Different groups of anarchists came together for a meeting on the Maidan. While they were meeting, a group of Nazis came in a larger group. They had axes and baseball bats and sticks, helmets. They said it was their territory. They called the anarchists things like Jews, blacks, and communists. There weren't even any communists. That was just an insult. The anarchists weren't expecting this, and they left. People with other political views can't stay in certain places. They aren't tolerated, a member of the group continued. The violence by the far-right groups was evidently condoned by Senator John McCain, who expressed his support for the uprising by addressing the Maidan crowd later that month. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and then U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt visited the square after the violence had broken out. As a side note, for those that don't know, they came with cookies and brownies and drinks, and they were handing them out to the crowd. All right. And if I can find a picture, I think I have a picture, maybe some video, I will put it with this video. NewsGuard's account of the events of February 21st, 2014 says that even though Yanukovych agreed that the earlier elections, angry protesters demanded Yanukovych's immediate resignation, and he fled on the day after. Hundreds of police guarding the government buildings abandoned their posts. NewsGuard then says protesters took control of several government buildings the next day. But the protesters had already seized government buildings as early as December 2013. On January 24th, protesters broke into the Agricultural Ministry building in Kiev and occupied it. On the same day, barricades were set up near the presidential headquarters. Government buildings in the west of the country had also been occupied. The Guardian, Green Check, reported on January 24th, quote, "There were dramatic developments in the west of the country on Thursday as hundreds of people forced their way into the office of regional governors in the city of Lvov and forced him to sign a resignation letter. Ole Salo, a Yanukovych appointee in a city where support for the president is in the low single digits, the letter said he signed the letter under duress and was rescinding the resignation. Thousands also stormed regional administration headquarters in Rivne on Thursday, breaking down doors and demanding the release of people detained in the unrest there, Union News Agency reported. In the town of Cherkasy, 125 miles south of Kiev, about 1,000 protesters took over the first 2 floors of the main administration building and lit fires outside of the building. Similar action took place in Ternopil, Ivanovo-Frankivsk, and Khmelnytsky in western and central Ukraine, as well as parts of the Northeast Party of the regions said. Protesters had begun occupying Kiev City Hall in December with a portrait of Ukraine's World War II fascist leader Stepan Bandera, very important, hanging from the rafters. On the night of February 21st, the leaders of the neo-fascist right sector, Andrei Perubi, announced that the Verkhovna Rada Parliament, the presidential administration, the cabinet of ministers, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs had all come under control of protesters. Therefore, NewsGuard has published false content by reporting that government buildings were occupied the day after Yanukovych fled the capital. It should print a correction. On the day after Yanukovych fled, the Rada voted without the presence of Yanukovych's party, the largest in the country, to impeach him after the fact of his violent overthrow. NewsGuard admitted the key fact that the impeachment vote was tainted by the absence of Yanukovych's party and that impeachment became largely irrelevant after violence forced him to flee the capital. Democratically elected leaders are removed by electoral defeat, impeached, or votes of no confidence, not by violence. That's right. NewsGuard writes that hundreds of police guarding the government buildings abandoned their posts that day. Yanukovych was forced out, but doesn't say why. As Jacobin, NewsGuard Green Checkmark, magazine reports, whatever one thinks of the Maidan protests, the increasing violence of those involved was key to their ultimate victory. In response to a brutal police crackdown, protesters began fighting with chains, sticks, stones, petrol bombs, even a bulldozer, and eventually firearms, all culminating in what was effectively an armed battle in February, which left 13 police officers and nearly 15 protesters dead. The police could no longer defend themselves from protesters' attacks, writes political scientist Sergei Kudelia, causing them to retreat and precipitating Yanukovych's exit. NewsGuard calls the events a revolution, yet revolutions in history have typically been against monarchs or dictators, and not against a democratically elected leader. For instance, the 1776 American Revolution, the 1789 French Revolution, the 1917 Russian Revolution, the 1952 Egyptian Revolution, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and countless others against monarchs. Coups, on the other hand, have been against both elected and non-elected leaders. Revolutions change political systems, usually from monarchies to republics. Ukraine's political system was not changed, only its leader. As a reader, Adrian E. commented below on this article, when a movement that is supported by about half the population and opposed by half the population violently overthrows a democratically elected government, this may be given different names, e.g. coup, but it is certainly not a popular revolution. The Maidan movement was never supported by more than half the Ukrainian population. It was supported by the vast majority in western Ukraine, by very few people in the east and south of the country, with people more evenly split in the center, north. This clearly was not a case of the government that had lost public support to such a degree that there was a general consensus that it should resign. It was the case of one political camp representing about half the country that had lost elections, imposing its will with brutal, deadly violence. Now, by any measure, Yanukovych's ouster was an unconstitutional change in government. His impeachment, without his party present for the vote, came after government buildings had been seized and after violence drove him from the capital. Okay, circumstantial evidence. In its version of these events, NewsGuard only refers to circumstantial evidence of the coup, interpreting it as U.S. support for a revolution against a democratically elected president. NewsGuard fails to point out that Senator McCain, Senator Christopher Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, as well as Victoria Nuland appeared on stage in the Maidan with Ole Tyenbach, leader of the neo-fascist Svoboda Party, formerly known as the Socialist National Party. NewsGuard does not consider how such events would be seen in the United States if a senior Russian foreign ministry official, two leading Russian lawmakers, and Russia's ambassador to the U.S. appeared on stage with a far-right American leader to address a crowd on the Washington Mall seeking to oust an elected U.S. president. And here is a fantastic point. NewsGuard does not consider how such events would be seen in the United States if a senior Russian foreign ministry official, two leading Russian lawmakers, and Russia's ambassador to the United States appeared on stage with a far-right American leader to address a crowd on the Washington Mall seeking to oust an elected U.S. president. If that president were overthrown violently, would the Americans think it was a Russian-backed coup? Yes. The answer to that, guys, this is a side note, this is not in the article. The answer to that is absolutely yes, without question. NewsGuard discusses Nuland's 2013 speech in which she revealed that since 1991, the United States had spent $5 billion to help bring about Ukraine's aspirations. What it fails to point out is that the U.S. aspirations were to turn Ukraine towards the West and away from Russia, and that the U.S. had work to do. In a 2008 poll, 17 years after the United States effort began, the year in which the U.S. said Ukraine would one day join NATO, 50% of Ukrainians actually opposed NATO membership against, and just 24.3% favored it. A 2010 Gallup poll showed that 40% of Ukrainians viewed NATO as more of a threat than a protector, and just 17% had the opposite view. So building up civil society through U.S.-funded NGOs to favor the West was a U.S. challenge. NewsGuard does not mention that part of the $5 billion spent was to help organize protests. There was a genuine popular dissatisfaction with Yanukovych that the NED nurtured and trained. Jacobin reported of the 2014 events, quote, U.S. officials, unhappy with the scuttled EU deal, saw a similar chance in the Maidan protests. Just 2 months before they broke out, the NED's then president, pointing to Yanukovych's European outreach, wrote that the opportunities are considerable while there are important ways Washington could help. In practice, this meant funding groups like New Citizen, which the Financial Times reported played a big role in getting the protests up and running, led by a pro-EU opposition figure. Journalist Mark Arness discovered the organization had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from U.S. democracy promotion initiatives. By the way, this is another side note. Some of that $5 billion went to building laboratories in Ukraine, funding from the Department of Defense to build biological research facilities in Ukraine, built by Black & Veatch. Yeah. Writing in Consortium News 6 days after Yanukovych's ouster, Pari reported that over the previous year, the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, which funds NGOs in countries the U.S. targets for regime change, had bankrolled 65 projects in Ukraine, totaling more than $20 million. Pari called it a shadow political structure of media and activist groups that could be deployed to stir up unrest when the Ukrainian government didn't act as desired. The NED, on February 25th, the day after the Russian invasion, deleted all projects in Ukraine it funded, archived here. The NED meddled in Ukrainian politics in 2004. Side note, really? The United States deleting evidence? Yeah, okay. The NED meddled in Ukrainian politics in 2004 in the so-called Orange Revolution. The Washington Post, green checkmark, wrote that in 1991 that what the CIA once did in secret, destabilizing and overthrowing regimes, the NED is now doing openly. CIA or NED-led coups are never made up out of whole cloth. The U.S. works with genuine opposition movements within a country, sometimes popular uprisings, to finance, train, and direct them. The U.S. has a long history of overthrowing foreign governments, the most infamous examples being Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Chile in 1973. In September 2013, before the Maidan uprising began, longtime NED head Karl Gershman called Ukraine the biggest prize in a Washington Post op-ed piece and warned that Russians too face a choice and Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself. In 2016, he said the NED has been involved in Ukraine since the 1980s and praised the overthrow of Yanukovych. NewsGuard omitted the Nuland Pyatt tape recording. Most significantly, NewsGuard's attempt to refute U.S. involvement in the coup omits the 2014 intercepted and leaked telephone call between Nuland and Pyatt, then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in which the two discuss who will make up the new government weeks before Yanukovych was overthrown. On the leaked tape, Nuland and Pyatt talk about midwifing a new government, Vice President Joe Biden's role, and setting up meetings with Ukrainian politicians to make it happen. Nuland says the prime minister should be Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and indeed, he became prime minister after the coup. At the time, the BBC, green checkmark, wrote of the leak, the U.S. says that it is working with all sides in the crisis to reach a peaceful solution, noting that ultimately it is up to the Ukrainian people to decide their future. However, this transcript suggests that the U.S. has very clear ideas about what the outcome should be and is striving to achieve in these goals. The U.S. State Department never denied the authenticity of the audio and even issued an apology to the European Union after Nuland is heard on the tape saying, fuck the EU. Mainstream media at the time focused almost exclusively on that off-color remark as a distraction from the greater significance of the U.S. interference in Ukraine's internal affairs. Why did Nuland say fuck the EU? Well, at the time she said it, France, Germany, and Poland were working for the EU on a political settlement with Russia to the Maidan crisis that would leave Yanukovych in power. Indeed, the EU brokered a deal with Yanukovych, who agreed to early elections by December, a restoration of the 2004 Constitution, and an amnesty for all protesters, clearing the way for no one to be held responsible for the violent ouster. Yanukovych announced the agreement with EU officials at his side in Kiev on February 21st, 2014. Later that day, he was violently driven from power. Leaving the historic role of the NED and the essential Nuland-Pyatt conversation out of its reporting is an omission of evidence by NewsGuard. That's right. Typical of corporate media, omitting crucial elements of a story changes its meaning, and in this case, undermines NewsGuard's account of the events of 2014. This is an excellent example of why Perry started Consortium News. That's right, to report on crucial information that corporate media sometimes purposely and deceptively, and you can bet your ass that's why NewsGuard did it, purposely and deceptively, leave out to change the meaning of a story. NewsGuard should correct its story about the coup, not Consortium News. NewsGuard invites readers to request corrections by emailing them at corrections@newsguardtech.com.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big 3 were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a 3-way, you know, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got, and he's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the 3, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, okay. I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.